What's up everybody, I'm Matt Gary, and in this episode of Coding with the Force, we're going to go over the different types of auth flows and why you might choose one over another when you're doing integrations with external systems. Alright guys, so in this episode we're going to go over the different types of authentication flows that you might choose for your integrations and why you might choose them. Really quick though, before we go into each of those flows, I want to talk about a couple terms, just a few of them. So the first one is authentication versus authorization. People get this mixed up, they think they're the same thing, but they're very different things. Authentication is the act of a user logging in to a server, proving who they are by the use of a username and a password and maybe two-factor authentication or whatever else. Authorization, on the other hand, is the act of actually giving users access to resources or giving an entity access to resources on a server. So authentication is logging in and proving that you are who you say you are, and authorization is authorization to access resources on a server. So when you think of authorization in Salesforce terms, think of the access that you give users on a profile or a permission set based level. Do they have access to the account object? Do they have access to the contact object, etc., etc., etc.? That's what authorization is. Authentication, logging in, authorization, access to data. Okay, cool. Now there are three types of flows, I guess, that we'll go over, or protocols that we'll go over. There's SAML, OpenId Connect, and OAuth. And SAML and OpenId Connect are extremely similar in their functionality. They're used to authenticate users. They're typically used for things like single sign-on. So when should you use SAML over OpenId Connect? There's really no rules here, but most new things are being built with OpenId Connect because it's kind of like the next evolution of SAML. At least that's how people are currently viewing it. So if something uses SAML already, then use SAML. If you're building something that's brand new to do authentication, you probably want to build it with OpenId Connect because SAML is basically a less evolved version of OpenId Connect. OAuth, on the other hand, is used for authorization, as in you, the user, are going to authorize server A to see server B's data. And that's it. You're not going to, it's not about authenticating a user or anything along those lines. It's about authorizing resources to be passed from one server to another. So very important things to distinguish between these different protocols. All right, so let's go over some of the more common flows or more frequently used flows that are out there. We'll start with SAML flows because there's only a couple of them. There's the identity provider initiated SAML flow, and there's the service provider initiated SAML flow. IDP stands for identity provider, SP stands for service provider. As far as when you should use these, you should use them to authenticate users, right? So typically you use this with single sign-on integrations with systems like Okta or Ping or whatever else you may be using. And as far as when you should use this, when you should use SAML over OpenId Connect, there's two scenarios where you use SAML over OpenId Connect. Historically, at least in my experience, and I think in a lot of people's experience, when you are authenticating with enterprise apps, so you're an internal employee at a company and you are able to sign on to different apps within that company. Say you've got Salesforce and Azure and some other Microsoft tools or whatever else. Maybe you've got G Suite. You would use SAML historically to do that single sign-on pass-through. Now, do you have to use SAML to do that? No. You could absolutely use OpenID Connect, and there's really not anything wrong with that. It's just that historically that's what's been done. More often than not, you'll see most of those enterprise applications have the ability to use SAML-based authentication, so you'll end up using them. But could you use OpenID Connect? Yes. And is there anything that's really wrong with that? I would say no. But someone out there, definitely feel free to fact check me and prove me wrong there. So let's go over this flow really quick just to see how it works. Basically, for an identity provider initiated SAML flow, you've got your user here. The user is going to try and visit the identity provider login page, and the login page is going to check to see, does this user have an existing session token? If they don't, then it's going to ask the user to authenticate with the IDP, as in log in, put in a username, password, security token, whatever else. And then after that user authenticates, they're going to be taken to the identity provider's landing page that is typically a home page with a bunch of links to external service providers. Those service providers can be anything, like we just discussed. They could be Salesforce. They could be G Suite. They could be, who knows, tons of stuff, right? So they land there, and then the user clicks on a link for a specific service provider. So let's pretend they click on the Salesforce link. The identity provider will generate a SAML assertion signed with the identity provider's private certificate and key, and then the SAML assertion gets sent to the service provider, and the service provider receives that assertion, validates it using that public cert key insert, and then the user is authenticated. A session token for the service provider is created and stored in a browser cookie, typically, and the user is redirected to the service provider's homepage. So basically, this flow starts with the user logging into the identity provider, and from the identity provider is passed through into one of the many services that that user might be interested in using. As far as the service provider initiated SAML flow, this one is when a user logs into or tries to visit the service provider. So let's say, again, the service provider is Salesforce and the identity provider is Okta. And so the user visits Salesforce. The Salesforce checks for an existing valid session token. When it doesn't find one, it redirects to the identity provider with a SAML assertion request and a relay state parameter. And it's not super important I go over that right now, but the user is then redirected to the identity provider. So they tried to log into the service provider. The service provider said, hey, you don't have a valid session token. You need to log in via your identity provider. The identity provider checks to see, have you already logged in? If you didn't, it asks the user to log in and authenticate. And once the user does log in, the identity provider generates a SAML assertion and sends it back to the service provider. And the service provider receives that assertion and logs the user in. So key differences between these flows is really just that the service provider is where the user is visiting first here, and the identity provider is where the user is visiting first here. The core mechanics of what's actually happening are relatively similar. So when would you use these flows? You use them when you want to do single sign-on pass-throughs typically, and you typically more often see this for enterprise applications as opposed to, say, enterprise users that work for a company and they're accessing applications that are internal to that company, as opposed to, say, me visiting Google and, you know, having Google authenticate me to some other service, right? You typically don't see SAML flows for being used for external users to your company, or just like somebody that's randomly accessing your site for one reason or another. That said, there are no 100% here. You could absolutely use a SAML flow to do those things. So don't be surprised if you run into that or end up doing that, because you do not have control over how it's requested you authenticate with another service. Just because SAML is most often used for enterprise internal users authenticating between systems doesn't mean that that isn't how you'll set it up for external users too, that are just logging into some random site of yours or something. All right, so let's go over a few of the more common OAuth flows. Web server flow, user agent flow, refresh tokens, which is not exactly its own flow, but we'll go over that in a bit, and the JWT Bearer Flow. So the web server flow, or often referred to as the authorization code flow, is probably the most secure of all the flows. I don't want to say that it is the most secure, because I can't say I know absolutely everything about all of the different authorization flows out there, but this is an extremely common authorization flow, and it is a very secure flow. So as far as when you should use this, you should always use this if you have the ability to store a secret safely. So when your application is going to integrate with another resource server, so we've got our client application here that's effectively integrating with this resource server. This resource server, or authorization server really, I believe, is going to basically provide to you a client ID and secret, right? If you have no ability to store that secret safely, then you cannot use this flow. I mean, you could, but you shouldn't. Otherwise, you have a massive security flaw and you might get yourself into some trouble. So when you use this is when you have a server in which you can safely store a secret, or a client secret, right? So typically you'll see this used when a user is traversing through the web to a website. That website is served via a server, typically, where you can house that secret key in the background and really not have to worry too much anyway about somebody stealing that key, client secret, and doing some real damage to things, right? So you've got a server where you can store this key or secret safely. You should use the web server flow, or the authorization code flow is what it's also referred to as. I'm not going to go through this through this whole flow. It's a very long flow, but I will post links to these flow diagrams so that you can check them out and read through them if you're interested. But basically, two things you need if you are going to use the web server flow typically. Number one, there is some level of user interaction. The user is using a user interface to interact with your application and to interact with the user is involved in the act of actually authorizing the resource server to give that client application data, right? You want some user interaction here. You want a way to be able to store the client secret safely. If you can do both of those things, or both of those things are on the list, you should probably use the web server flow. The next one on the list is this user agent flow. This is most common, or it's also very commonly called the implicit flow. This is most commonly used for mobile apps. So mobile apps, they really have no good way to store a client secret anywhere. You could, but that's kind of a big risk because you're kind of storing it on their phone, really, typically. So you'd have your client secret out on like everybody's phone, which wouldn't be great. So instead you use this user agent flow. And what it allows you to do is authorize or authenticate users based or without the use of a client secret. So is it a little less secure than the web server flow? Definitely. However, this user agent flow will allow you to still protect that secret key and authorize your users in a way that's beneficial to them, right? By the way, just to be super clear, these flows are usable by OpenID Connect and OAuth. So you'll see both of those protocols used for both of these flow types, or really all the flow types I'm about to describe to you. So you can use this for both just authorization of getting resources from the resource server to display on your mobile app or your web application, or you can use them to authenticate users to do single sign-on pass-throughs or whatever. Yeah, I don't think I'm missing anything, so I'm gonna move on. And I hope I didn't. Again, I'm not gonna go through each step in this flow, but I will post these flows so that you can take a look at them and check them out more for yourself if you're interested. The next one that we're going to talk about is called the refresh token flow. It's kind of not even a flow on its own, really. This is just how refresh tokens work. And I wanted to go over this because in integrations, you're going to be asked to use a refresh token. And if you've never done integrations before, you're not even going to know that that's what you're being asked to do. So when should you use refresh tokens? The answer is when people don't want users to have to log in over and over and over again, right? Or authenticate themselves over and over and over again. So without the use of a refresh token, you are going to have, let me rephrase this. Whenever you reach out to an authorization server, the authorization server is going to return to you an access token, and if you request it and the authorization provides you the option to request it, a refresh token. And what access tokens do is they typically expire within a couple hours, right? Normally that's typically about as long as an access token lasts. They can last longer. Hopefully they don't. That's not super ideal, but access tokens expire pretty quick. So to prevent your users from having to log in over and over and over every 2 hours or every 15 minutes, however long that access token is valid for, you can use what's called refresh tokens, and you can take that refresh token once it's deemed that your access token has expired and pass the refresh token to the authorization server instead, and it'll just give you a brand new access token without having the user log in again to authorize themselves and to get things done. So if you're ever requested, this is super common in mobile application integrations. It's also super common in lots of other places. It's very common in other places too. But if you ever get the request to not have to log in multiple times or have the user log in multiple times, then the use of a refresh token and knowing how it works is important. So that's what a refresh token is, and that's when you should use it. You're typically going to use it only when it's requested that users do not log in over and over, or don't have to authenticate more than once, or more than once every 4 months, or something along those lines. All right. The JWT Bearer Flow. JWT stands for JSON Web Token, and it's a way to basically, without having to have a user constantly authenticate, it allows you to take this web token, send it to an authorization server, and have the authorization server say to you, okay, I know that I trust this JSON web token. I'm okay allowing you to access the resources on my server, more or less. As far as when you want to use a JWT flow, this is most commonly used when you don't really need or want to have the user interact with this integration, right? So maybe this user has already authenticated once, and they've given you permission to act on their behalf, right? You typically are going to ask the user to at least authenticate one time for a JWT flow integration. But then in the background, right, maybe you're constantly looking for new data, or every 15 minutes you run a scheduled job, and that reaches out to the resource server. You might use a JWT then to do your integration with that other resource server. That said, that's typically the only time that most, well, at least the vast majority, I think, of people use JWT, when you don't need user interaction via a mobile device or a browser or whatever else. But like I said before, there are no 100% here. These are all just suggestions based on, best practices or community standards or whatever else. So definitely, don't think that you can't authenticate with JWT. If you do have user interaction, you still absolutely could do that. It's just that this is typically only done behind the scenes without user interaction. So those are the major flows. I'm going to go over just a few other ones. I didn't write them all the way out because they're less commonly used. Most people are not going to get into them, I don't think, but they're still worth talking about. So there's a couple other common flows called the device flow, the asset token flow, and username and password flow. And the device flow is basically a flow that you use whenever you've got maybe a TV or a coffee maker or a microwave or something like that needs to integrate with some external system. You would use what's called a device flow to make those integrations work in a secure manner. The asset token flow is commonly used in similar situations to the device flow, but a little bit different. So this is used for the whole Internet of Things concept. And you'll see this most often used in devices that have no user interface, but they still need to integrate with something to work. So you'll see this asset token flow used when you're in that realm of having a device with no UI integrate with some external service. There's a bunch of weird ones like that. But, you know, are you going to use this super often? I would say not so much. The username and password flow, I kind of wondered whether I should even bring this up. Can you use username and password flows? Yes. Should you use username and password flows? Probably not. The only time that you would really use a username and password flow that it would be like, I think moderately accepted would be when your identity provider and service provider are one and the same, and you're trying to authenticate into it. That said, there's still other ways you could still use other flows to do that, and it might be a bit better. But that is another flow that's out there. You can use it. Sometimes you have to use it because that's your only path forward. But yeah, I think we've covered everything. I'm just gonna really quick recap each one of these flows just so you know when you should use it and why you should use it. SAML flows, you're typically only going to use these for single sign-on pass-throughs, and you're typically only going to use these for internal employees for a company trying to get into internal enterprise applications. That is more often than not where you see SAML flows. Could they be elsewhere? Sure, but that's where you're really going to use them most frequently. Refresh token flows, or the use of a refresh token in a flow, really, is going to be done when you need to make sure users do not get logged out and they don't have to re-authenticate over and over and over, right? You still got a layer of security there. The refresh token has to be sent out. It has to be authenticated, all that kind of stuff. But the user doesn't have to type in their username and password to get things done for your integration. Web server flow, you're going to use this anytime you have user interaction with an interface. Although that's not a hard and fast rule, you don't have to have user interaction with an interface to use this. But you absolutely need to make sure that you can store a client secret securely on a server somewhere before you use this flow. Because if you can't and you use it, then you will be in a world of security trouble. User agent flow, use this flow when you are using a mobile device or also a single page application where you cannot safely store a client secret. If you can't store this client secret, user agent flow is what you should look into, and it's what you should use. JWT Bearer Flow, use that when you have no client interaction in the UI, typically, and you just want a nice, easy way to constantly authenticate with the resource server over and over and over again. And like we just went over, device flows are for things that have limited UI capabilities, like a TV, a coffee maker, whatever else. Asset token flows are used for weird things that don't have UIs, that are devices, so that need to integrate with other systems to do whatever it is they need to do. And username and password flow. Typically, you don't want to use this, but if you do use it or you need to use it, hopefully it's when your service provider is the same as your identity provider, at least what you're integrating with. So I think that's it. I tried to make this quick because all we're trying to talk about, despite there being a lot of concepts here to be aware of, is when to use which flows and why, and just to make you aware that all these flows exist. I will give you access to each one of these flow diagrams that I've created for the more commonly used flows, so you can check those out. I'll put a link to my GitHub so that you can take a look at these flows and do whatever, you know, get to learn them a little bit better, I suppose. If you like this video, make sure to subscribe. If you want to know the next time I upload a video, make sure to hit the bell icon. And if you want to make sure you see the videos that you want to see on this channel, then go over to the community page and vote. Every week I give you the opportunity to vote on the videos that you get to see next. So check it out and vote, or be sad that somebody else did vote and you didn't get to see what you wanted to see, which would be so sad. So, you know, go over there and vote. That's it for this one, guys. I hope it's been helpful, and I'll see you guys next time.